And having spoke with thousands of podcasters and worked with hundreds, there are three recurring mindsets that we see that are insidious. They creep up on people. They slowly but surely make a big dent on the way people see their podcast, the motivation people have behind their podcast, the expectations, and it eventually leads to failure and are massive contributors to the crazy stats about 70, 80, 90% of shows quitting within X amount of time. It changes all the time. So let's talk about the three biggest mindsets that lead to failure in podcasting. I'm Tygo Shea.
I'm Anthony Winery. So I guess the first thing is having unmet expectations. Look, a lot of podcasters start their podcast with the expectation that they can have an interview-based show, do the work, stay consistent, and the podcast will grow. The expectation that if they just keep posting on social media, promoting constantly, their podcast will grow. But the truth is, those expectations, when they aren't matched, when you do all the things you feel like you're supposed to do to grow your show, and the podcast doesn't grow, well, what happens when you have all these expectations and you work hard and do everything you're supposed to do to grow your show, quote unquote, but the podcast, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years in, still isn't growing? Well, what happens?
Well, you get frustrated, you start doubting, but most of all, you are frustrated that your expectations just did not match the reality.
You're pretty pissed off. You're a bit annoyed. So I think that's the first thing is like people having wrong expectations of how to grow. So what the hell should you do? If that's the thing, what are the wrong expectations to have? Instead of having expectations of what the outcome should be, focus more on your own inputs. Focus more on, hey, what do I expect of myself? How do I expect myself to show up every time? You know, what actions can I take on a day-to-day basis to make sure the podcast is getting better and to make sure that I actually am testing different strategies and I have metrics that I'm measuring. Because I think like then you actually have a better gauge of what to expect as a result. But we have all these grandiose ideas and you're following strategies that you don't know if they're working or if they're not. Your expectations are built off of false premises. I'm using very fancy words here. False premises.
False premises is fine.
That
makes
premises.
sense. I think what you've said actually sums it up really well, which is, and this is quite a big concept that we're talking about. I think really the answer lies in being a lot more measured, and instead of thinking, well, I'm going to do this podcast and I would imagine that I'm going to have a lot of people listening and a big audience in a year or 6 months, instead of keeping it grandiose, keeping it large, really thinking, okay, if I do the podcast consistently and let's say I try and feature as a guest on other podcasts once a week for the next 3 months, and if I can even get 10 listeners from each of those podcasts on average, then I should really have at least 100 people listening to my show, and 100 people listening to the show is a lot more in downloads. So let's see how this pans out. Now, I don't want to get too overcomplicated and too mathematical here, but the point is just being a lot more measured, right? Having hypotheses, and taking actions towards them, and then having a much more digestible and tangible goal in mind that you're trying to hit, rather than just starting with the hopes of success and wildest dreams and only really having that to measure, which is obviously a huge thing to measure up against.
Yeah, and again, building on that, so if you're going to start a new strategy, give it time for it to work. You know, what's the word? Unmet expectations is also, doing a strategy that me and Tyler might talk about, like guessing on other people's podcasts and thinking that after guessing on 5 shows, your podcast is going to blow up. When it's like, no, it's like maybe guessing on 5 shows over a prolonged period of time, 6 months to a year, then see what the results are. I think that's the other piece of it as well. Trying a strategy and just thinking that, if I change just one thing in my podcast, then the podcast will finally take off. If I get one viral clip, then the podcast will finally take off. If I get a high profile guest on, then the podcast will finally take off. Those expectations are just way out of whack. So I think we all kind of instinctively know these things,
Cracks
but it's also
you say way out of whack.
But it's also sometimes we need to be reminded, right? Things can take time, and that's okay. So target guess the second mistake that leads to podcast failure.
Well, the second mistake that leads to podcast failure is really being too busy, stuck in the weeds of running the show to be able to think strategy. And I'm looking for the word here. Not making excuses, not kidding yourself, but kind of letting it pass by that you know what you're doing isn't really, you're not seeing growth, or you don't really know what's working. And if you really think about it, you have to figure that out. But just thinking, but like I'm just doing such a good job, even just by staying consistent. It's so hard just to run the show in the first place. I'll get to that in time. That is such an easy mentality to fall into. It's letting yourself off the hook. And I really mean that in the most empathetic way, because it's so natural. It's just, who wouldn't, basically? We do sometimes to an extent. But really letting yourself off the hook for not pushing forward and really doing what you need to do and thinking strategy and figuring things out, because you're so up in the nuts and bolts of running the thing. And I think what that leads to, if you project out, is podcasters come to us 2-3 years down the line sometimes, and they're hundreds of episodes deep, and they've just been trying the same thing, and they've got all this work to show for it. They put in hours and hours, blood, sweat, tears, money, but they haven't actually given themselves time or prioritized stopping to think, going high level, thinking about the strategy they're using. And when I say going high level, what does that mean? Just really being analytical, coming from an outside, looking at things from an outside, unattached perspective, seeing what's working, tracking the numbers over the long term, even potentially getting external feedback on their podcast. All these things are necessary to figure out why the show isn't growing and move forward. But a lot of people put that off indefinitely just because I'm running the podcast, that's good enough for now. And really, if I had to distill it to a mindset, it would be that. Putting it off because, well, I'm running it, that's enough for now. I'm doing a great job just doing that. And you are, which is the difficult thing. You are doing a great job. But still, if you want to grow.
I mean, yeah, you are right. It's very hard to have that balance. But also we've got to be honest about the things that we want. If you want that as a goal and you want to grow the podcast, you want all this amazing things from it, just be upfront with yourself and hold yourself accountable. And if you can't hold yourself accountable, maybe think about joining the Get More Listeners Academy. Anyways, and then we've got the final thing. I think the final thing is a bit of a sad one, to be honest with you, just losing hope. I think you're feeding off the back of what you just said there. 2-3 years into the podcast, you've done all the right things, but you've had all these unmet expectations. You wanted to be profitable by now, but it's actually spending, maybe 500 to 1,000 on an editor and a producer. You want to be growing month after month, but it's still declining. Maybe it's not really working. And you then start to lose hope. And as you start to lose hope, you start to lose motivation. And when you lose motivation, you don't give as much to the show. And because you don't give as much to the show, well, your audience can feel that, they can sense that, and then they stop listening, and slowly people stop listening, and it creates this vicious feedback loop, this negative feedback loop where you basically lose hope, lose motivation, stop putting as much effort into the podcast because you're not getting an ROI, and as a result your listeners feel that and they stop listening, and because they stop listening you then become even more disheartened and lose even more hope, and you just quit. And I think the mindset here, I don't know if this is you right now, but I just want to just share this with you. Know that it's going to be worth it. All the time, all the effort, all the energy you've poured into the podcast, if you just stick at it and take a step every single day towards the right direction, improving your titles, improving your content, thinking about your audience, being of service, it is going to be worth it. I can't guarantee the timeline in 3 months or 90 days, but just know when you get there, as long as you stick on this path, it is going to be worth it. And that's honestly what I want to just share with you, because it's so hard being an entrepreneur, being a podcaster, being a creator, doing all these different things, essentially gambling, hoping, but know that you will get there if you just keep at it. And I think that's really the last thing that messes a lot of people up. And it's sad, because there's so many good shows with so much potential and they just lose hope, fizzle out, the podcast die, but they stuck at it for another year. Who knows where they would have been.
Right. It's so true. You're right. It is really sad. And again, I think a theme of all of these things is these are all such natural ways that we will, as humans, just default to unless we consciously break out of them and do the things that is required to not slip into these. So it's a hard thing, and again, most are unaware, and so they slip in and they don't realize they've slipped in. So hopefully, if you're listening right now, can see yourself in any of these, see yourself on a path to any of these. Hopefully this episode at least can help you stop and think, reassess, and potentially switch up the trajectory a little bit.
So, to finalize, set realistic expectations with yourself. Try not to get too stuck in the nuts and bolts, and give yourself space and time to think, to strategize about your next move in order to grow your podcast. And please, God damn it, never lose hope with your podcast. It is going to be worth it. And if you do those things, you're going to absolutely crush it. And I know you're going to crush it. So keep at it, and I'll catch you in the next episode.
For sure.